In this video, I really want to talk about what I feel like is one of the more overwhelming things that we run into when we are out there bass fishing. Now, this happens to pond fishermen, it happens to lake fishermen, it happens to river fishermen. And that is when you get to a body of water and there is an abundance of cover. When you get to the lake and or the pond and there is just grass everywhere, grass on the shoreline, grass out in the middle lake, maybe you get to some lakes and it's nothing but standing timber. What do you do in those situations? How do you break that down? Because there's a number of different bodies of water where there's a lot of cover. Maybe docks, maybe the entire lake that you fish is nothing but docks. So how do you break that down so that you can get to catching more fish and not being hung up in all this cover or wasting a lot of time? Now, before we get into the video, this one's brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. Guys, I've been running a sale for the month of June and it is over in just about a week. So right now you can get a USA made sun shirt, one of the only USA made sun shirts on the market, a pair of sun gloves, and a bass hat with a wooden bass badge on it, all for $84 plus free shipping. This has been a pretty big hit actually for the month of June, and you have just about a week to take advantage of it. So I'm gonna leave a link down below in the description. It's really easy. All you gotta do is add the sun shirt that you like to cart, add the sun gloves you like to cart, add the hat you like to cart. It will automatically discount at checkout. Shopping at Finn Fishing is truly the best way to help support this channel. All right, let's talk about the abundance of cover. This is something, like I said, to me, it's one of the more overwhelming things that you can see in fishing. And to me, the first time that I really ran into this was actually fishing in Florida, because in Florida, the lakes down there are pretty much nothing but grass. You got different grass that grows on the bank, and you have grass that grows just everywhere. And so when you get to those lakes, sometimes you're sincerely overwhelmed. Like, everything looks good. So how do you break down those bodies of water? I've also seen this a lot growing up in different ponds. There was ponds by me that you get to them in the middle of summer and it's nothing but weeds. Like, there's weeds all over the place, there's grass all over the place. So what do you do? Now, I have a few different things that I think you can do in those situations, and I'm gonna talk about those right now. Now, the first thing is always, this is the most important, always pay attention to the structure or the bottom contours, because depending on if you're fishing in a lake or a river, even in some ponds, we'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, something that you can really do that's going to help you get around fish is simply look at the structure that all this cover is on. For example, I have fished in places where there was a tremendous amount of standing timber. And what you almost have to do when you get into those areas is completely take the standing timber out of your mind. As hard as it is to do, because that's all you can see, you really have to take the standing timber out of your mind, and really all you want to do is concentrate on the bottom and what the bottom is doing, because then it becomes a lot like our more traditional bass fishing. For example, when I get to a lot of lakes in the summer, I'm gonna revolve a lot of life or a lot of my time around fishing points and fishing drops and fishing humps, you know, offshore pieces of structure that I know bass like to get around. So when you get to that lake and it's nothing but grass or it's nothing but standing timber, whatever the cover may be, think about the structure that cover is on, and think about how the bass will use it throughout the year. So then what you start to do is you really just start to fish the structure like you normally would. I'm gonna fish the end of a point, or I'm gonna fish a ledge, or I'm gonna fish a hump. But then what happens is you just have to kind of use the right lures that make sense for all the cover that is there. For example, if I'm fishing down where there's a lot of standing timber, a lot of times what I like to do is fish, you know, like a football jig on the structure in that standing cover. So I may find a small rock pile, or maybe it's just a hard bottom spot on that point or that hump that I'm fishing. I'm gonna fish it in that area because I'm gonna fish a football jig in that area because that's what I would normally fish. And I know that that also works for standing timber, excuse me. Now, hopefully I'm making sense to you because I'm losing track of my words a little bit here, but the same thing is if it's grass. You know, if I've been to lakes before where it's nothing but grass, you get to those areas, I'm looking at little subtle points in the grass on my mapping. And instead of, you know, a football jig in a lot of those situations, I'm gonna use something that can kind of go through the grass or around the grass or over the grass. So it might be a jerkbait or a chatterbait or a Texas rig. So one of the biggest things that you can do to help separate and help really fine tune where you're going to fish and all that cover is concentrate on the structure. And figure out what the bass like structure-wise. Because you might find out, yeah, this whole lake is covered in grass, but it's only the points where I'm getting bit. Only on those points, or only on the ledges. You know, a number of years ago, I fished on Lake Oneida up in New York. And at the time, there was a ton of grass on this kind of major flat. And I knew that this flat always played. Like looking at past tournament results, I was up there for a tournament. This particular area of the lake, it always played. Like there was always fish that were caught in this area. But when I got to it, I was overwhelmed because it was all grass. There was grass everywhere. And so what I ended up doing is really spending the time to idle around. And what I found is, I found one little small rock cluster that was in the grass. And I was really, honestly, I was lucky to even see it. Because it was just something that I'm like, man, I think that that's rock in there. And then I pitched a jig in there and I actually could feel the hardness of the bottom. So I found a rock bottom kind of on a point in that grass. That was literally one of the best areas I've ever found in any lake. Like it had a ton of bass in it. And I've done that in a number of other situations that are similar. So just think about the structure that is on the bottom of your lakes. Okay, let's move on to the next point, which is, and I'm gonna talk about kind of pond fishing here at the very end, just for you that may be listening for that part. The other thing that you honestly always have to think about is, especially in the summer, is bait fish. If you have a ton of cover out there, it's all great, but the bass are really only gonna be there a lot of times if there's food there, especially during the summer. So even though you may have a ton of grass or a ton of standing timber that's absolutely everywhere and it all looks good, if there's not bait in that area, then it's pretty much not worth fishing a lot of times. And a lot of times bait can be easily seen not only with your electronics, but with your eyes. A lot of times you're gonna see bait balls on the surface. So bait really becomes a very vital element to what I'm doing, especially in those summer months where the bass really kind of just revolve their life around the bait. So think about that example that I talked about earlier where I was saying, hey, there might be standing timber or grass everywhere, but it's only the points where you're getting bit. Now refine that one more step, and now it's only the points with bait fish where you're getting bit. So now you get to this lake or this body of water that's covered with cover, and now you're really able to eliminate and figure out exactly where the bass are, because now you know I need to look for points and I need to look for bait. And then when those two things hit with the cover, I throw a jerk bait, I catch fish. That's how fishing can be a lot less overwhelming when you get to some of these lakes. You may even refine it on top of that, because you may even figure out, hey, it's actually main lake points that the bass are relating to, or it is secondary points that are inside creek arms, but it's the one closest to the mouth. So you can really get, sometimes, even though you have an abundance of cover, you can get really dialed in to exactly where these bass are. And it's all about paying attention to your surroundings, and again, making sure that there's good bait in the area and that there's some sort of structural thing in the area to hold bass as well. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is ponds, because I actually have had a couple of people comment on not only this channel, but on Bass Fishing HQ in the past, talking about like they get to their pond, their favorite pond in the summer, and it's nothing but choked out weeds. Now, if you're catching fish in the springtime on that same lake, like bass, those bass have to be somewhere. They have to be somewhere in those ponds with all the weeds. Now, the first thing is really understanding the particular grass or weeds that are in your pond, because all of these particular types of weeds and grass are going to grow a little bit differently, and understanding how that particular type of grass grows can really help you to understand how the bass are going to position in them. For example, if you have hydrilla in your pond, which is never really a good thing if I'm being 100% honest, hydrilla can get so tight and so packed that bass really cannot get into it. Like they physically cannot get inside of it. So in those situations, the only place that you're going to catch bass is anywhere you have a hole or you have a ledge, or an edge, or if you have some sort of matted vegetation that has developed. Now this is one of the big things for ponds is anywhere you have mats, the longer it goes into the summer, the more that those mats are going to kind of condense and get really thick. And the thicker that they get, a lot of times it blocks out all the sun and it kills the grass that's below it. So that really thick mat sometimes ends up being the best place to catch a bass because it's really the only place those bass can go. I saw this on a pond, like literally not last year, but the year before that. It was a pond that never typically had grass in it, and all of a sudden this one year a little bit of grass got into it. The next year the whole thing was grass. It was nothing but grass. And the way that this grass grew is that in areas it would be very thick. It was a pond weed, but there was particular areas where it was so thick that it started to mat up, and then everything under it started to die. And I made the exact same pitch 8 times in a row, literally into this mat with a heavy weight, fishing in a pond with a 1 ounce weight into this mat, and caught 8 bass in a row. All these fish are in this, I'm spitting, all these fish are in this really tight area because it was like literally one of the only places that they could go. So always look for the mats on those lakes. Your lake may be choked out, but there's gonna be a section where there's a mat. And you have to figure out a lot of times if you can get under that mat, or sometimes a frog becomes your best friend. Sometimes, you know, I just did a video on BassFishingHQ where I talked about fishing a frog on scum mats in ponds. That can be something that happens a lot. And sometimes you can get those fish to bust up through the mat. Sometimes that mat gets so thick that you can't get a fish to come through it. You have to go into it. And when you have to go into it, you have to step up your weights. You have to use ounce weights, 1.25 ounce weights, 1.5 ounce weights to get down there to it. Now, the other thing I want to talk about with ponds, and we've kind of already brushed on this subject, is the best thing about having a pond that's kind of choked out with weeds is it really eliminates your bait choices. Like you are pretty much going to be fishing a frog or a toad style bait, or you're going to be fishing a Texas rig. So the biggest thing that I can say when it comes to fishing a Texas rig in really choked out weeds is try to fish the lightest weight that you can get away with. But a lot of times, like I said a minute ago, you might have to step up to over 1 ounce weight to simply punch through the weeds and punch through the mats that you're fishing. But always try to fish the lightest weight that you can get away with, because lighter weights are going to typically get more bites, and they're going to allow you to not have issues with hooking up with those fish. Sometimes when you're fishing 1.5 ounce weight, like you can just run into issues hooking up with a fish. And sometimes it's hard if you don't have the right equipment for that. It can also be really hard to fish. So I hope that this has all helped you somewhat kind of think about the lakes or the ponds that you are fishing and how you can attack them a little bit better to help separate yourself from others in the future. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. You may like this most recent video. Also, you may like this, or you may like my fin fishing gear. All right, see you tomorrow.